My name is Matt. I live near Stratford-upon-Avon in the UK. I write music for a living and know absolutely nothing about mechanics. I do ride, but I've only ever really done oil changes and maybe switched out the occasional set of spark plugs. I've always loved the look of modified K-bikes, so it seemed like an awesome idea to attempt a full strip down with no mechanical knowledge whatsoever. I once did this to a car. A 1972 Citroën DS found at the bottom of a river in Spain. It was a long and very difficult process to restore this car. I was hands off, but it ended up costing a huge amount of money and a lot of heartache along the way. Which is why I'm kind of amazed at myself for wanting to do this again. I decided that as I was going to do a full teardown, there was very little point in buying a pristine bike. So I started looking around for unconverted bikes or barn finds or any old shed. I eventually found a bike not too far from me, about an hour away in Gloucester. The photos were pretty sketchy, but everything appeared to be where it should have been. And there was a full set of luggage, liners, manuals, all paperwork, and the keys were present. Off to get the K-bike, hired a van. Let's go see what it's about. It was a non-runner and had been standing for more than 12 years, which was less than ideal, but the low price, proximity and the extras meant it was probably worth it. I was also hoping that its life as a police bike meant it had at least been well maintained for that period of its life. I managed to pick the bike up without a problem. The luggage and windscreen were detached, so there was quite a lot of extra stuff to load, but I lashed it down and got it home in one piece. Once I got home, I dragged in some mates to help me get the bike into the garage. It was in a pretty poor state. There was no battery in situ, not a surprise after 12 years, so this was one of the first things that I ordered. All of the essential components seemed to be present, which was a relief. The rear tyre was soft, and as I was to find out later, in fact punctured. Again, not really an issue as I was going to be changing all the wheels and tyres anyway. The bars and controls were weathered and tatty. They'd also be going. The finish on the engine, case and transmission was dire. The front brake was non-functioning and the petrol cap was broken. I thought for anyone who was thinking about doing this, it might be an idea to log the costs as I go along. I'll include every last sundry and any tools I have to buy. I'll try and break it down into different sections to make it easier to work out. I won't include cost for time, but I will log the time. It'll be a lot slower than somebody who knows what they're doing, but it'll be a benchmark of sorts. I got on eBay and started ordering things I knew I was going to need, and definitely did not have. I'd already started to think about the look of the build. I was pretty sold on the retro ride lateral suspension platform and probably the seat platform as well. I've got a friend who's got a set of Ducati 748 forks that I can use, and with a bit of research it seems that it can be made to work. I want to use tri-spoke wheels, especially on the back. I was thinking seriously about clip-on handlebars rather than riding some bars over the top of the forks. Colour-wise, I was fairly committed to black and yellow as an overall theme, a bit like a wasp. Black tank, black frame, yellow rims, yellow shock if I can find one. The first job was to strip the massive fairing off the bike. I enlisted some cost-effective labour to assist. I I was unsure where to start, so I googled it and found a decent step-by-step guide. Just the fairing weighs a ton. It even had stereo speakers installed. As soon as it was done, I was able to access the battery compartment. I found various terminal wires dangling where the battery should have been. I attached them with fresh bolts, but it was at this stage I made my first major mistake, one that would cost me a large slab of time and effort. But more on that later. Next up, an oil change. Realistically, I wouldn't be using this oil for riding, but I wanted to get rid of what lurked in the engine, as it had been standing for so long. After this, I also changed the transmission and then the final drive oil, the latter looking quite grainy and silty. I decided to chop off the rear end of the subframe. Not because it was necessary at this point, but because it would look cool in slow-mo. I ordered an angle grinder, and this would be its first outing, and in fact my first time using an angle grinder as well. As it was my first time, I was taking no risks and decided to suit up. I was quite fond of my fingers and I wanted to keep them around. Never having used an angle grinder before, I was surprised at how quickly the discs disintegrated as I started to use them. Even just this small modification totally changed the look of the bike, and it took a step closer to being what I wanted it to be. Next to go was the ABS system. I'd already cropped the ABS computer and loom, labelling everything as I went. Now for the massive cylinders. The ABS on these bikes was reputedly pretty bad, so I wasn't really bothered about losing it. At any rate, I could always sell the cylinders later. After this, it was the turn of the rear sets. The right-hand set removal went to plan, but when I came to remove the left set, I encountered a thoroughly seized bolt. In my efforts to get it free, I rounded it. There was no room to cut a slot in because of the rear set housing, so as I was not going to use it, I decided to cut through it. This allowed me full access to the bolt, and at this point I got a heat gun and some mole grips. As I was to find out, the seizure was a product of galvanic corrosion, a reaction between the steel of the bolts and the aluminium of the block. This was not to be my last seized bolt. I tried the ignition on the bike, the lunchbox lit up. It was in neutral and the starter turned the engine over, but there was no buzz from the fuel pump before or after the ignition was pressed. I checked fuses, all fine. I checked that there was a current coming through the connector block into the tank. There was. Although I didn't really understand what was going on with these readings, as my electronics training finished in third year of secondary school when I was 14. To make things worse, the petrol tank had a leak just below the fuel pump in a position that I'd learned was a common fault on K-tanks. I decided that as I was going to have to remove the internal components, I may as well replace them. They were 27 years old and would need replacing at some juncture anyway. I found a supplier in the US that could send them for a decent price, so I ordered them up and started looking into fixing the hole in the tank. It had been done before using some sort of resin, which was now corroded and hanging off. After asking on some forums, I decided to try some metallic epoxy putty that some people have had some success with. I would have it welded if necessary, but I thought I'd try a less invasive option first. The putty arrived and I applied it carefully. It dried and a few days later I tested the tank. I'd read some people had used liquid tank liner to good effect, so I ordered the rather expensive POR 15 kit, carefully prepped the tank and applied the liner. I realised it was time to find a welder, but this was difficult as everywhere was shut due to the coronavirus lockdown. I went on a local forum and found a guy who could do it. He was a fellow biker and cut me a decent deal. The weld was ugly, but it worked. I installed all of the new components in the tank, but realised when I'd removed one of the breather tubes, it had perished and sheared off. There was no nipple where the pipe met the bottom of the tank, and the pipe had just ripped out. This in turn had caused a new and significant leak. I decided to test the tank anyway to see if the new pump was working. Nothing. Next, I removed the tank connector block and attached a new block. Nothing. I removed the pump and connected directly to the battery. This worked, so I surmised that the problem must be electrical. I then spent hours testing wires with a circuit torch to no avail. I went online and asked forum members for their wisdom. There were lots of suggestions, all very logical, but most of which I'd already tried. A guy called Frank asked me if the injector brain was properly connected. I took a picture and asked him if this wire was supposed to be connected to the battery. Apparently not.
You're a dumbass.
No! I removed this wire, which turned out, according to Frank, to be an extra earth added by the police to reduce interference with their radios. I reconnected everything, added petrol and tried again. To my massive surprise, this happened. After 12 years under a tarp. As I wasn't really expecting anything, I didn't film it properly, so I did it again with some nicer angles. So, all this just to get to the start line. There was a huge amount to do and even more to learn. Primarily, I'd learnt that you don't attach an earth wire to a battery. Next, it was time to start stripping the bike and see what other horrors awaited. If you found this mildly interesting, like and subscribe. Likewise, if you can see me doing something terribly wrong or you have some advice for me, get into it in the comments. The next episode will be along in about 4 weeks, so you can continue to laugh at my bungling ineptitude. Until then, see you later.